On August 9, 1974, amidst the fallout from the Watergate scandal, Richard Nixon became the first president in American history to resign. 1 month later, his successor, Gerald Ford, pardoned him of all crimes he may have committed as president. To some, this pardon was an act of mercy that would give the nation time to heal. To others, Ford had just allowed a crook to escape punishment. The pardon of Richard Nixon is the most famous, or infamous, pardon in American history, and it's part of a much larger debate over the power and purpose of the presidential pardon. The ability to forgive crimes originated in medieval England as a power of the monarchy known as the prerogative of mercy. The monarchy delegated this power to colonial authorities in British America, and after the American Revolution, the pardon power became a subject of debate during the drafting of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton proposed giving the pardon power to the president, reasoning that pardons needed to be granted expeditiously whenever the courts erred. Most delegates to the Constitutional Convention agreed, leading them to reject a proposal that would subject presidential pardons to the Senate's approval. Ultimately, the delegates chose to impose few restrictions on the pardon power. While the president cannot pardon impeachments or violations of state laws, the Constitution allows them to pardon any other offense against the United States. This power was first exercised by the first president, George Washington. During Washington's tenure, Congress levied a tax on whiskey. However, farmers despised this tax, and many refused to pay it. Hundreds of outraged farmers attacked tax inspectors and burned down their homes. This revolt, known as the Whiskey Rebellion, collapsed without a fight after Washington personally led militiamen against the rebels. Most of the rebels escaped criminal prosecution due to a lack of evidence, but 2 men, John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, were convicted of treason and sentenced to be hanged. Washington delayed their executions and, during this time, granted amnesty to rebels who now followed the law, the first use of the presidential pardon power in American history. A few months later, Washington pardoned Mitchell and Weigel. In granting these pardons, Washington hoped to employ moderation and tenderness as a gesture of reconciliation. At the Constitutional Convention, the delegates had considered exempting treason from the scope of the pardon power. They theorized a president might use their subordinates to commit treason, then pardon them to avoid justice. In the end, the delegates rejected the exemption, reasoning that impeachment was an appropriate remedy. By pardoning treason, Washington showcased the president's broad power to pardon for the first time. Decades later, in 1833, the pardon power was tested in its first major legal case. A man named George Wilson was convicted of robbing the mail and endangering the life of the mail carrier. For this crime, he was sentenced to death. President Andrew Jackson issued a pardon for Wilson's death sentence, but, unexpectedly, Wilson refused to accept the pardon. Because it was uncertain whether or not a person could reject the pardon, the Supreme Court was forced to step in. In United States v. Wilson, the court decided that, based on English precedent, individuals could decline a pardon. This decision established that the presidential pardon is descended from the prerogative of mercy, thus constraining the pardon power within the bounds of English precedents. In this case, the court found that precedent allows people to reject pardons. Precedent also allows the president to grant conditional pardons, a type of pardon that only takes effect if a certain condition is fulfilled. In 1851, William Wells was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, but before his execution could be carried out, President Millard Fillmore pardoned him on the condition that he be imprisoned for life. Although Wells initially accepted this conditional pardon, he later challenged his imprisonment as unlawful, arguing that the Constitution only allowed the president to grant absolute pardons, with no conditions attached. The Supreme Court took up his case in Ex Parte Wells, and decided that because the Wilson decision grounded the presidential pardon in English precedent, and English precedent allowed for conditional pardons, then the conditional pardon must be constitutional. Wells's pardon was upheld, and the right of the president to grant conditional pardons was confirmed. After Fillmore's presidency, continuing tensions over slavery culminated in the Civil War, and the presidential pardon was used as a powerful tool for Reconstruction. President Abraham Lincoln offered amnesty to the Confederates during the war to encourage them to give up their fight. After the war, many former Confederates faced treason charges, but President Andrew Johnson granted amnesty to those who took a loyalty oath. However, this amnesty excluded high-ranking officials and wealthy plantation owners who had to apply for individual pardons. Over the next few years, Johnson generously distributed pardons to these individuals and expanded the amnesty. On Christmas Day, 1868, he issued an unconditional amnesty to all former Confederates, including former Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Johnson sought a swift reconciliation of the nation, and he used the pardon power to advance this goal. Congress, on the other hand, favored a much more stringent Reconstruction and sought to punish traitors. A bill passed in 1865 required all attorneys to swear they had never supported the Confederacy to practice law. an attorney named Augustus Hill Garland was effectively disbarred because of his service in the Confederate Senate, but Johnson pardoned him for his role in the rebellion. Garland argued the pardon allowed him to practice law without taking the oath required by Congress, and his case went before the Supreme Court. In Ex Parte Garland, the court ruled in favor of Garland, declaring that a pardon eliminates any penalties an individual would otherwise face, as if they had never committed the crime in the first place. Furthermore, the court proclaimed the pardon power to be unlimited, except in the case of impeachment, and that it cannot be constrained by Congress. The Garland decision found that the Constitution bestows upon the president a powerful pardon power that exists beyond legislative control. Ex Parte Garland also found that the president can even pardon people before they've been charged with a crime. This would be further litigated when President Woodrow Wilson granted George Burdick a pardon. Burdick had been summoned to court as a witness in a fraud case, but he refused to testify out of fear of implicating himself in the crime. The pardon would have forced Burdick to testify, as it would have cleared any guilt, preventing him from refusing on the basis of avoiding self-incrimination. If he accepted the pardon and still refused, he could be jailed for contempt of court. Burdick declined the pardon, but was still jailed for contempt after again refusing to testify. The Supreme Court stepped in and reaffirmed United States v. Wilson, deciding that Burdick had the right to refuse a pardon and thus the right to refuse to testify. The court also reaffirmed the right of the president to preemptively pardon individuals after they allegedly committed a crime, but before an indictment. While Burdick had not been charged with a crime, Wilson could still offer him a preemptive pardon for any actions he took which might constitute a crime. Interestingly, the court also found that accepting a pardon is an implicit admission of guilt, though this part of the ruling was a dictum, meaning it's not legally binding. Courts hold people in contempt to maintain order and ensure that the court is respected and obeyed. Philip Grossman was held in contempt after he violated a court order requiring him to stop selling alcohol, which was illegal at the time. Grossman was sentenced to a year in prison and was ordered to pay a fine, but he was pardoned by President Calvin Coolidge on the condition he pay the fine. Although Grossman accepted the pardon and met the condition, he was still in prison because, supposedly, pardons could only forgive violations of laws passed by Congress, not criminal contempt of court. In pardoning contempt, Coolidge allegedly eroded the authority of the courts, violating the constitutional separation of powers between the judicial and executive branches. Grossman challenged his imprisonment as unlawful, and the Supreme Court weighed in on his case. In Ex Parte Grossman, the Supreme Court ruled that the president could pardon criminal contempt of court because of English precedent. Additionally, the Constitution enables the president to pardon any offense against the United States, which includes contempt. A contempt pardon cannot violate the separation of powers because the pardon was specifically meant to allow the president to check the power of the other branches of government. While the pardon power is often tested in court, it was subjected to unprecedented scrutiny in the court of public opinion in the case of Richard Nixon. Although Nixon had not yet been charged with a crime for his involvement in the Watergate scandal, Gerald Ford believed it was in the best interest of the nation to move on. In Ford's eyes, Watergate was an unending American tragedy that had divided the nation and challenged its institutions. As president, he was tasked with providing the greatest good for all Americans, and thus he believed it was his duty to end the nation's protracted nightmare. Ford defended the pardon by citing the dictum of the Burdick decision, arguing that Nixon accepted his guilt in accepting the pardon. Regardless, the pardon was immensely unpopular, and some accused Ford of taking part in a crooked deal, wherein Nixon gave him the presidency in exchange for a pardon. Most Americans wanted Nixon to face justice, and the pardon dealt significant damage to Ford's public image. Lingering animosity over the pardon is commonly cited as a factor in Ford's defeat in his 1976 presidential campaign. After the Nixon pardon, presidents have been more willing to grant clemency in service of their personal interests. During Ronald Reagan's presidency, several government officials were implicated in the Iran-Contra affair. These officials sold weapons to Iran and transferred the funds to the Contras, an anti-communist organization that was rebelling against the socialist government of Nicaragua. Funding the Contras was illegal, and many of these officials faced criminal charges for their role in the scandal or the ensuing cover-up. Reagan and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, claimed they had been unaware of the affair. Bush succeeded Reagan as president, but he lost his re-election bid in 1992. After his defeat, but before his term ended, he pardoned 6 officials who were involved in the affair. Bush called these men true American patriots who were victims of the criminalization of political differences. However, many criticized Bush's pardons as an attempt to cover up the extent of his own involvement in the affair. Bush was possibly afraid of being summoned to testify in the trial of Caspar Weinberger, one of the 6 officials he pardoned. To this day, it's unknown exactly how involved Reagan and Bush were in the affair, and Bush's pardons only added to the uncertainty. While Bush's pardons were controversial, his successor took it to another level. Bill Clinton granted relatively few pardons throughout his term, but he granted well over 100 pardons on his last day in office. Several of these last-minute pardons were heavily criticized, especially the pardon of Mark Rich. Rich was a billionaire indicted on charges of illegally trading with Iran during an embargo and tax fraud. After being indicted, he fled the US and attempted to renounce his citizenship. At the time of his pardon, he was an international fugitive and was on the FBI's most wanted list. Interestingly, Rich's ex-wife made generous donations to the Clinton Presidential Library and to Hillary Clinton's Senate campaign prior to the pardon. Clinton's pardon of Rich was deeply unpopular, and most Americans believed he granted the pardon in exchange for financial contributions. Many of Clinton's other last-minute pardons were directed towards friends and former business partners and government officials who were caught up in various crimes. By pardoning these individuals at the very end of his term, Clinton likely hoped to avoid any political backlash. President Donald Trump was also heavily criticized for his use of the pardon power. Trump gained a reputation for handing out pardons to friends, supporters, and political allies. Like Clinton, many of his pardons were granted towards the end of his presidency, minimizing the negative repercussions. There was also significant speculation around Trump granting himself a pardon at the end of his term for his alleged tax fraud, his efforts to challenge the results of the 2020 election, and his role in the January 6th Capitol riot. Although he ultimately chose not to issue a self-pardon, Trump's federal criminal indictments amidst his 2024 presidential campaign have again raised the possibility that, if elected, Trump could pardon himself. It's unclear whether or not a self-pardon would be constitutional. The Constitution does not explicitly forbid a self-pardon, and the pardon power has historically been subjected to few limitations. However, some argue the text of the Constitution implicitly outlaws self-pardons, as someone can't really grant something to themselves. Additionally, a self-pardon would violate the legal principle that one cannot be a judge in their own case. At the height of the Watergate scandal, Nixon considered pardoning himself, but a memo from his Justice Department found a self-pardon to be unlawful because Nixon would be serving as his own judge. Regardless, the constitutionality of a self-pardon will likely remain uncertain unless a president decides to issue one. The pardon power allows the president to unilaterally forgive any federal offense, including treason, and this power is grounded in English precedent. Precedent allows people to reject pardons, and it allows the president to issue both absolute and conditional pardons. This power can be used to grant amnesty to large groups of people, and it cannot be restricted by Congress. Pardons can be granted at any time after a crime has allegedly been committed, and they do not necessarily constitute an admission of guilt. The president can also pardon criminal contempt of court. After Watergate, many recent pardons have been heavily criticized in the court of public opinion. Lastly, it's constitutionally unclear if presidents can pardon themselves. The Constitution grants the president a nearly unlimited power to pardon, which many have called into question, as the pardon's ease of use also makes it easy to abuse. There have been numerous proposals that would curb the strength of the pardon power. Congress could play a larger role in pardons, such as requiring the Senate to consent to pardons, as was considered at the Constitutional Convention. Alternatively, presidents could only grant pardons which have been approved by the Justice Department. There could be restrictions on who the president can pardon, such as banning pardons for family members and close associates. Preemptive pardons and self-pardons could also be banned. Last-minute pardons are often the most scandalous, and freezing the pardon power during the last months of a presidential term could prevent last-minute abuses. As the pardon power is granted to the president by the Constitution, all of these proposed reforms would need to take the form of a constitutional amendment. But perhaps an amendment is unnecessary. Congress and the public could just put their trust in the presidency to use the pardon power appropriately and hold it accountable when it doesn't. After all, most pardons are not granted with malicious intent. Restrictions on the power could deny necessary justice that only the president, acting alone and without inhibition, can deliver. Whatever the case, controversy and debate will likely loom large over the power of the presidential pardon.